Something wrong with your hand?
Me?
Janet?
I went out for a walk with my friends Eileen and Pete on Sunday.
That's always risky. Yeah.
And slipped over and landed on my elbow.
Oh no.
Just to let everyone know, we're now streaming live on YouTube and we're being recorded, hopefully. So it'll be there.
Be careful what you say.
For posterity. And if I make
All right.
Hello, Caroline Larkin.
Hello, how are you? I'm trying to find.
Hi, John and Kay.
Hello, Glenda.
Yes, Colin.
I'm now. Sorry, I was going to find a better place to sit to be. There we are.
Right, Colin, you're host now.
Okay, I will admit people then.
If you could admit people, it is 7:30 now. So, if you perhaps could mute everybody, Colin.
Yep.
And
remember, you and Patrick will need to unmute yourselves. Yep. Okay.
Okay. Yep.
You're all muted.
So welcome to everybody. We've got 44 on the Zoom and there are more people joining us on YouTube. So welcome to you if you're joining us on YouTube, especially to members of Patrick's Benefice, who I think might be viewing this as well. So welcome to everybody and to some of the people from the diaspora who are joining us from outside the deanery as well. And this is a really exciting time, I think. I was just reflecting with our staff meeting today to have the churches in a whole deanery to be reading John's Gospel together all the way through Lent and learning together. It's something quite remarkable there and something really of the spirit. So I think we're in for a really exciting journey together between now and Easter. And I'm hugely grateful to our friend Patrick Whitworth. Patrick lives quite close to us here, but has to be with us on Zoom, obviously. And so just before you start your talk, Patrick, I'm just wondering if you'd like to quickly just say a few words about yourself and just get people, so people can get to know you a bit.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you very much, Gerald. And as you say, it's very exciting to be together and it's great to see you all. And I know there's others who I can't see as well. So great to be together. Yeah, I'm Patrick, married to Olivia, and we live in West Berkshire. We've got 4 married children and a number of grandchildren. So I'm that kind of age. And I've been ordained in the Church of England since 1976, which seems like a long time ago, and started work in a place called St Michael de Belfort in York for my first curacy. Then went to a church in central.
Patrick, you're muted. Sorry. Patrick, could you just unmute yourself?
That's
better.
Now.
Yeah, that's fine. Sorry. Yeah, we just.
Should I go back over?
Just a couple of seconds.
Okay. And so I started work up in New York and then was in central London at Holy Trinity Brompton for nearly 5 years. Then we went to southeast London and worked in a parish in the Crystal Palace area, a place called Gypsy Hill, which was great. And a number of our children were born around about then. And then for 21 years, I was rector of a church on the north side of Bath. So some of you may know that, a place called Weston. And so I was there, as I said, 21 years, and we had a great time there. Other things I enjoy doing, I like writing. I've written a number of books on church history and also on biblical studies, like travel and play a few rounds of golf occasionally, that kind of thing. And yeah, that's a bit about us. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Patrick. And just before you start on your talk, let's just pause and remember God's presence with us wherever we are, joining us by his Spirit from all our homes, as I read the passage which you'll be talking to us about in John chapter 2. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there are 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to his servants, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it. When the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine, and did not know where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first. When the people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." This, the first of the signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him.
Well, thank you very much, Gerald, for reading that. And just to say again at the beginning how delighted I am to be able to come and share these talks with you over Lent, beginning obviously this evening, Shrove Tuesday, and going on into Holy Week just before Easter. And 7 talks, all taken, as we know, from St. John's Gospel, in which we're looking at a number of conversations between different people in the Gospel of St. John and Jesus at critical moments in the life of that individual who has that conversation with Jesus, or critical in the life of Jesus himself, particularly as we come to those later conversations nearer to his passion, cross, and resurrection. Now, as we're looking at St. John's Gospel, and I know you're reading it as well in your daily readings, I want to say a word about it, and then we'll look at this particular conversation, which is between Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Jesus at the time of this wedding in Cana of Galilee. But some words about St. John's Gospel, which you're probably very familiar with, but I think it's still worth saying. It was the last of the Gospels to be written. It was written probably, we don't know for sure when, but probably around about 90 AD, or possibly a little bit later even. It means that John was now probably in his mid to late 80s. So that gives us hope for those of us who are a little bit older, that there's still lots we can do at that time of life. It's written almost certainly in Ephesus, which is in present-day Turkey. We know that John, possibly with Mary, because he looked after Mary, the mother of Jesus, moved to Ephesus round about, or perhaps a bit before 70 AD, which was the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. And he lived in Ephesus for the remaining part of his life, although it's quite probable that he went for a short period of time as an exile, as a punishment for being a Christian, to Patmos, which is in fact not very far away from Ephesus, where he received, which we believe it was him, the Revelation, which is the final book, the Apocalypse, the final book of the Bible. So you have to imagine him in Ephesus, and we're told by a church historian, a man called Eusebius, Bishop of Caesarea, which is in Palestine, that at the very end of his life, John used to be carried around on a litter, on a bed, because he couldn't walk. And he would say to people who came up to him, "My little ones, love one another. My little ones, love one another." And that's recorded by Eusebius in this book, which you can get as a Penguin edition even today, and read these things for ourselves. So that's rather a lovely insight into John and his life at Ephesus. And it was there that the gospel was written. And when it was written, a little bit later on, it was described by one of the early church fathers, whose name was Clement of Alexandria, as a spiritual gospel. Now, in a sense, they're all spiritual, aren't they? But what he was saying was that this had a kind of resonance and a profundity to it, which made it a gospel which you could never quite get the bottom of, because it was so profound. And so it was called the spiritual gospel, and it was written in a rather different way to the other three gospels, which we generally call the synoptic gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, you may know this, but the Gospel of John is built very carefully around 7 signs. And this evening, we're looking at the first sign, which is the miracle of the changing of the water into wine at Cana of Galilee. So the 7 signs, which start now and go on, in fact, to the very end of the Gospel. The final sign is the great catch of fish in John chapter 21. It's also built around 7 sayings, I am sayings. Jesus says, for instance, I am the resurrection and the life, which we'll come to when we think of the raising of Lazarus from the grave later on in our series. The 7 I am sayings, I am the bread of life, another one. They're all familiar sayings, but so important to the gospel. The gospel is also built around the Jewish feasts in Jerusalem. There is a Galilean ministry, but it's not so marked as in the other Gospels. What we have in St. John's Gospels are these feasts in Jerusalem, the Feast of Tabernacles, of course, the Feast of Passover later on, in which Jesus taught and was in Jerusalem and spoke to the people and indeed the Jewish leaders there. And during these feasts and around them, we have some very long discourses, that's teaching that Jesus gives. And the final one, which is the discourse in the upper room, beginning in John chapter 14, goes on for 2 or 3 chapters and is immensely important. One other last thing to say about the gospel is that there's greater insight in St. John's gospel about the Trinity than in any other gospel. That is the workings together of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And there's probably more about that relationship between the 3 of them in the Godhead than in any other gospel. And maybe that was a very deliberate thing for John to do in writing this gospel, to give us that insight into how they, as it were, work together, if we're going to put it like that. And John is called, as we know, the apostle of love. Or to put it another way, he calls himself the beloved disciple. He doesn't name himself in the gospel, but he talks about the disciple whom Jesus loved, which is interesting. He should do that. I mean, he loved them all, but there was some special relationship between John and Jesus. As we know, John was the one who lay, as it were, on the breast of Jesus in the Passover meal of the Last Supper in the gospel. And today we're going to look in the next few minutes of my talk about how Jesus meets us in emptiness. Around this conversation between Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Jesus himself. And it's interesting just to note this, that this is the first appearance of Mary in the gospel. We don't have any infancy narratives like you do in the synoptic gospels, except for Mark. We go straight into that amazing opening preface to the gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and so on. And so we have Mary here with Jesus at a wedding. Now, weddings have been hard to come by in lockdown over the last year, and I know about that, and I'll say a bit about it in a moment. The Jewish weddings were hugely important in the life of the community. In fact, there's been quite interesting discussion in the press just recently about Orthodox Jews and their weddings in North London and how they should reduce the numbers of people attending because they love a wedding, I imagine. That's why they have all these people. I'm slightly breaking the law at the moment, I think. But in Christ's own day, we find that a wedding probably went on for something like 3 days. It was a lengthy affair. There were different stages to it. And it seems that we've got to the point where maybe the couple have now gone through their betrothal and their marriage, their vows, whatever they exactly did in the Jewish wedding. And now they're all together. Maybe at that time they're going to have toasts and speeches. I don't know exactly how they ran a wedding in the 1st century Palestine, but it was a big deal. And we almost certainly know that Mary was a relative of the couple who was getting married. That's Mary, the mother of Jesus. So she was invited. She came with her own family, Jesus and the brothers and sisters that he already had, and he was now about 28 years of age. So his family was grown up, the family around him. And not only that, but he came with all the disciples, another 11 hungry and thirsty people. So you can see they were quite a crowd, just that family, let alone everybody else. They were a big guest list. And the wedding proceeded. And then it came to this moment of potential embarrassment and difficulty. And in this conversation between Mary and Jesus, I want to pick up on particularly two things that are said, and then one thing that arises out of that conversation that is said by another person who's in fact the person in charge of the festivities and the feast. And they're kind of things we can reflect on, these simple words, which I think are very telling and very profound. And the first one comes at the beginning of the conversation between Mary and Jesus, where she says simply to him in verse 3, they have no more wine. They've no more wine. Can you imagine it? You know, you're coming to the most important part maybe of the ceremony, where they're going to be toasts, where they're going to be maybe speeches, and they look across to where all the wine is kept and they're completely run dry. And it's going to be a great embarrassment. Well, as I said earlier, Olivia, my wife, and I have arranged 3 weddings. We have 3 daughters. And so we know a bit about arranging a wedding. And it's my job generally to buy the wine, which I'm happy to do for the wedding. And so, you know, I generally consult with the bride and groom with what they're going to eat and what kind of wine they'd like and all that kind of thing. And then go off and purchase it. Don't go across to France necessarily and buy it over there, but buy it locally. And I practically always over order because I don't want to be in the situation that these guys are in here, that suddenly there's not enough wine and we're all embarrassed. And so I slightly over order, and there's no chance of making a trip to the supermarket on the day during the festivities, as that would be very time consuming. But it does mean that when everyone has gone, they haven't drunk everything. You can drink a little bit more as the days or months go by. But there was an impending embarrassment now that there was no more wine. Now, that was a fact in the wedding, but I think, you know, knowing John, it was more than just saying, you know, there isn't any more wine for them to drink. I think he's saying something more profound. The reason for that is that John, if you know him in this gospel, he loves symbolism. He loves metaphors. He loves allegories. In fact, Jesus often teaches in allegories where he says, I am the vine and you are the branches in John chapter 15, and other allegories are to be found in the gospel. So on the one hand, we're hearing, yes, there is a problem here. There needs to be a solution to this catering crisis. But there's also something more profound going on as well. And I think it's this, that John is saying through this story that actually Judaism and the old ways and trying to keep the law, all of that has run dry. There is no more wine. You know, we've come to the end of the old ways. Something new, something dynamic, something fresh, something wonderful needs now to happen. And I get that particularly by reading back to those amazing opening words in the prologue of the gospel, which you'll know well and would have been read, I'm sure, at Christmas several times in your hearing, where we're told these words. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Here's a contrast. The law came from Moses. That was one dispensation. but grace and truth come through Jesus Christ. And I think in a way, what John is telling us and what Jesus is telling us indeed in this miracle is that the old ways are coming to an end and a new way is beginning. And this Gospel of St. John is going to tell us what that new way is all about. That's not only emptiness, as far as producing wine for the wedding is concerned, but the spiritual emptiness in the life of the nation and its future, as far as its spiritual life is concerned. How does Jesus meet us in our emptiness is kind of the question that we're looking at this evening. And another way of looking at it is in fact our own personal lives, because from time to time we ourselves feel, don't we, empty or overwhelmed by the things that we're having to face, and not least, of course, in this last year of this pandemic and how that's affected us all. I was very touched just a few weeks ago when I was reading an article in the paper about someone who lost their parent at the beginning of this year in 2021. And she was a professor, Professor Greenhalgh, and she wrote a message, I think, for everyone else to read and to share in, and she put it on Twitter. It's pretty poignant. I'm going to read it out. It says, "Goodbye, Mum. You died of COVID-19 days before you were due to be vaccinated. You told them in the hospital to give the ventilator to somebody else. I said a FaceTime farewell from a hospital car park to you. You will have a Zoom funeral. You are 2020, but thanks to the devoted, exhausted NHS staff." And I thought, how poignant. And that was the beginning of January. And of course, we know how bad it's been in the remaining weeks of January, with so many people being admitted to hospital, 20,000 or more. And perhaps for us, it's a question of saying, yes, I feel empty. There is a loss of human contact, no hugs, some a loss of earnings and uncertainty about the future, some a loss of well-being, and for some a loss of a loved one. And we can face, therefore, spiritual, emotional, psychological depletion, possibly even feeling empty. And that all comes out for me from this simple remark of Mary to Jesus at a wedding when the wine had run out. And she says, "They have no more wine." So it could be true for us personally. It could be true for us like it was for the Jewish people spiritually. It might have been true physically as it was for the wedding, that they'd simply run out of wine. Well, that's the first kind of thing. The second thing, I just got three from this conversation, is what Mary again says to Jesus. She says these words. She says these words: "Do whatever he tells you." Do whatever he tells you. I find that fascinating. I mean, you can think about Mary, and of course, she's now probably in her 40s. She must have reflected from time to time on the birth of her child, on how she came to be pregnant, on all the extraordinary happenings. And she's seen now Jesus grow up into being a man in 28. Now he's about 28. He's just beginning, we're told, his ministry. This is the first of his signs, according to John. And Mary has said to Jesus, "They've no more wine." Now, Jesus' response is quite interesting because it's not very encouraging if you look at it. He says, "Woman," which is actually a way of addressing any woman in those days. It wasn't particularly rude. It could sound a bit rude to us in our culture. "Woman, why do you involve me? Why are you dragging me into this? My hour has not yet come." It's rather enigmatic, isn't it, of Jesus? And there are occasions in the Gospels where Jesus, of course, is rather enigmatic in his response to people when they ask him for things. And I don't think it's because he won't give it to them or won't listen, but because he's kind of drawing out the person in their desire. Although he says something also rather profound, which is, my hour has not yet come. And of course, that hour will refer later, as we'll see in the Gospel, to his hour of passion and the hour of his crucifixion. Nonetheless, Mary is not put off. Do whatever he tells you, anticipating that he is going to say something thereby. And Jesus says to the servants, fill the jars with water. So they filled them to the brim. So they did what they were told, the servants. And they must have taken quite a long time filling these very large jars, some of which held over 120 liters of water, up to the brim, which is what they did. But I want to pause on that word again, do whatever he tells you, because again, I think John is not just saying something in that situation to the people then, but also he's saying something, isn't it, to everyone who reads the gospel, which is do whatever he tells you. And I think this course over Lent, and indeed this particular time in the year, is an opportunity when we can rather deliberately try and listen to God and what he may be saying to us. Yes, we listen to him in his word. We listen to him in what he says to us in creation, all the beauty that is around us. And also we can listen to him in a particular event or an occasion. A person told me this story some years ago. I've always remembered it. He was a guy who was running away from home. He was a young man. And he was running away from Edinburgh. And he stowed away on a train going down from Edinburgh to King's Cross in London overnight. He didn't really know why exactly he was running away, what he was going to do, but he took the train, he got down to London, he woke up wherever he was on the train, and he looked across at the neighboring track where another train was stationary, and it was a goods train some years ago. And on the side of the goods wagon in chalk was written these words for the railway employee: go back to Edinburgh. That was a word about that truck going back to Edinburgh, not staying in King's Cross. This young man looked at it, and for some reason, mysterious, isn't it? He thought, well, God is speaking to me. Go back to Edinburgh. And he did. He went back, he was reconciled with his family, and he told me, and later on he became a missionary. Do whatever he tells you. And my hope is, and I'm sure your hope is, that as we go through these different conversations, we may hear something for ourselves and for our own spiritual journey. And then the third thing that I just want to draw out, the last thing, is not, in strictly speaking, the conversation between Mary and Jesus. Is the result of what happens, and it's a little conversation between the master of the feast and the bridegroom, in fact. And it's these words which we find looking at the passage in verse 10, which again are very telling, where the master of the feast says, you, the bridegroom, he doesn't even know anything about this, the bridegroom, remember. You saved the best till now. Because what happened, as we know the story, is that the servants were told by Jesus, having filled up all these great jars with water, to take some of the water and to pour it into the glass of the master of the feast, the ceremony. And whether it had happened in the actual jars or on the way, I'm not sure, but probably in the jars, a miracle had occurred and this wine had been made. The water was drawn off and the wine was served. And when the master of the banquet tasted this wine, he was amazed at what? He didn't know the quantity, in fact, because he didn't know about the jars, really, I don't suppose, but he knew about the quality. And he thought, this is a stunningly good wine. I don't know whether you know your wines in particular, but let's say it's a sort of Chateau Margaux 1995. Stunningly good wine. Okay. And the man says this, he says, everyone brings out the choice wine first of all, and then the plonk, for the guests have had too much, and they're only going to waste a good wine because they're too tipsy already. I might appreciate it. But you have saved the best wine till now. And there are two things remarkable about this. One is the exceptional quality of the wine itself, served at the end. The other thing is the extravagance of Jesus. Because actually, if you tot it up, which I have done in the past, it is well over 600 bottles of wine. Now, when I'm ordering for a wedding, and I've ordered, as I said before, on a few occasions, I might, at the outside limit for 150 people, get 200 bottles because they've got to drive home, most of them. But this, this party had a further 600 bottles of very good wine. It was extravagant. And also it was exceptional. And again, I don't just think it's about the wine. I think it's actually John saying something about what's happening here. He's saying, isn't he? Yes, we've run out of wine, we've run out of kind of true spirituality in our nation. But Judaism, if you like, has run dry. That someone is now needed who has extravagance and who has an exceptional quality to offer, which is remarkable. Again, I go back to the prologue and to what John says before this chapter that we're looking at today. He says, out of his fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. Well, that ties in for me to this miracle here. The best has been saved till now, and the best, as far as God is concerned, is the giving of his Son to the world, the Word made flesh, who is the exceptional quality of spiritual life, which is now being offered to all people everywhere. And also the resources of this person are endless. In other words, the best has arrived in Christ. Yes, I do believe a miracle took place, but yes, I also believe that this was indicative of something that God was offering in the sign, because it was a sign, to everyone who understood that. Out of his fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. And then we're told this marvelous sort of throwaway bit at the end of this sign, at the end of this conversation by John. He says, what Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first, you remember, of the 7 signs, some of which we'll be looking at, through which he revealed his glory. And his disciples believed in him. Again, I find the prologue is really like an overture at the beginning of the symphony of the gospel, and the phrases that we find in the overture come up repeatedly through the whole of the gospel. And it's no surprise that we read this in the prologue. The Word became flesh, made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And again, John picks up, doesn't he, on that phrase of glory in his summary of the sign. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs, through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. In summary, then, as I close this first of our conversations, Jesus met a situation which was dangerously close to empty, which had the potential of full embarrassment for the hosts. But they were the people who ran out of wine at their son's wedding. This would be named throughout the village and the area. But Jesus does a miracle. And the way Jesus meets us in our emptiness is, first of all, I think we need to kind of acknowledge our need, just as Mary acknowledged the need of the wedding party and said, look, they have no more wine. Then secondly, to remember that amazing phrase of Mary's in that conversation with Jesus, speaking, I think, to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Over the 7 weeks, my hope and my prayer is that we will engage with God. He will speak to us in the way that he wants to. And for our part, we may do whatever he tells us. But also to recall these amazing words at the end of the miracle, end of the sign, that you have saved the best till now. That we could try and believe that even in this awful situation that we find ourselves in, which is getting a bit better in our country and indeed the world, which is caused by the pandemic, that even in this situation, we can find the best, which is on offer to us. The grace upon grace that comes from his fullness. So I think it's a wonderful beginning, this sign. And, you know, I've said this when I've spoken on this before. I said, you know, if I was asked what would be the first miracle that the Son of God would do if I didn't know this story on earth, I would probably say, you know, a great healing or a great resurrection. But the first sign that John tells us about is he produced a vast quantity of wine of exceptional quality to meet a need which he was told about by his mother. And you know, I find that absolutely marvelous because it's so unexpected and so wonderfully descriptive of what Christ has come to bring. And surely that's why it begins the gospel, to take us on then through all the other things we'll see over the coming weeks. So thank you for listening. It's a joy for me to talk about it. And I'll hand back to Gerald.
Thank you, Patrick. That's been a really inspiring talk, and there's so much to it, lots of depth to your talk as well as to the gospel. And you've given me some questions which will be on the website.
Right.
People who want to, or we can dwell in some of them now, but we'll certainly put them on the Vale of Pusey website so that if people want to reflect on them through the coming week and in house groups and things, you can. But now is the time for people to give their own comments, their own reflections, their own questions, either sort of wave at me. If Colin, if you could help spot people, because we've got 58 participants, so we're over a lot of screens. So,
fire a question, please do, for reflection.
Either raise a hand or unmute yourself and just pitch in. I'm looking for hands.
Stephen.
I was thinking on the generosity and the extravagance of God. When we come to Holy Communion, we have the feeding of the 5,000 and the making of water into wine. Each speaks of a most generous and extravagant God. brought together in the sacrament of Holy Communion.
Mm. Yeah, I mean that's absolutely right, isn't it? And as you say, you know, Holy Communion is another meal, really, isn't it? In which God is sharing Himself with us through bread and wine to feed us, and that kind of very simple meal, of course, extended now across the whole world through all the Christian communities, provides a wonderful nourishment, really, for for people as they come to receive that. So absolutely, Stephen.
Patrick, thank you enormously. I'm 61 years of age and I've never been to a Bible reading before. So this is an exciting new experience from me, and I've absolutely adored it. I love you being the most generous father ever. And just a little reflection, I rather love the way he listens to his mother.
Yes.
The fact that it is something, and you know, women were not that well regarded in that time. And I love just that quiet observation of what she says and how he responds.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you, Millie. I think it's wonderful. And I think the thing for us to reflect on is that we'll come to it, of course, towards the end of the gospel, is that John was made the guardian, really, of Jesus' mother. And that happened, as you may or may not know, but at the cross, when they were standing together and Jesus said, you know, you must, John, look after Mary, and Mary, you go with John. And just to say, I did this trip to Ephesus some years ago in 2008, and you know, I can't be absolutely sure how much these is a fact and how much these things are legend, but there is a place in just outside Ephesus which is called the Home of Mary, you know, it's thought that she ended her days there. You can't be sure, but John went on looking after her, and so he was party, I imagine, to all kinds of information from Mary, and maybe it was, you know, in part what she said that gave him the opportunity to write this sign, or you know, although of course he was there as well, he was one of the 12, so but maybe he had a bit more inside information from Mary about what was going on. It's nice to think that anyhow, but thank you, that's such a good point.
Tim Wiles has got his hand up. You unmute yourself first.
That's me, innit? I was trying to unmute. Yeah, that's great. I was awesome. Jesus is amazing. I got a question for you, Patrick.
Yeah.
So when I was listening to the story, I found myself feeling like these people don't deserve to they don't deserve Jesus to do this miracle for them, because it's their fault, innit, right? That they didn't order enough wine, and I mean let's face it, they ain't gonna learn if we just keep providing them with supernatural wine all the time. And what I was wondering is how can I avoid becoming like the Pharisees, and how can I have the heart of God and not this kind of sort of like harsh, how can I avoid becoming like the very thing that they would
Well, that's such a good question. I mean, that's such a profound question, Tim, really, absolutely. And interesting that you know, it's interesting that next week we will be looking at a Pharisee, if you're back with us next week, who's called Nicodemus, and he had to move from, you know, his sort of Pharisaic tradition to the way that Jesus does things. And I think it's all to do with the way in which you know, Jesus is moving away from law. You know, the law came through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. And I suppose maybe the answer to your question is, and it's a very kind of simple answer to your question, is that the closer we live to Jesus Christ, then the more likely we are to respond in the way that he would like us to. Okay? And I think we'd all say amen to that. It's one thing to say it, it's another thing to do it. But you're absolutely right. You know, they didn't deserve it. but that's the whole point. You put your finger on it. You know, the whole point of grace, of course, is we get something we don't deserve. And that's what it is. That's why it is the exceptional wine, really. It's not like the old stuff, which was a law where you're always trying to prove yourself and not getting there. So
Colin.
something like that, Tim.
Colin, you.
Yeah, thanks, Gerald. And thank you, Patrick, for a really, really deeply moving reflection, and really appreciated it. Immensely appreciated it. Particularly, I think your focus on the line. Let me just get rid of that. Sorry. Oh, there we are. The line, do whatever he tells you, that meant a great deal to me. I thought that really leapt out to me. The other day, when the reading came up in the lectionary on a Sunday, we looked at a picture. There's the famous picture of the wedding feast at Cana by Veronese in the Louvre. And what I love about that picture is it's so full of a huge crowd of people. And it's a bit like what Tim was just saying. How do we change? Because when how can I make sure that I'm not going to be like the guests who just take everything for granted? Because in that picture, there's so much detail that you can miss. The miracle is taking place in the bottom right-hand corner, and you wouldn't even really notice it was going on. And there's something, as you said, about the wine, the extravagance of it, and yet the fact that this is the first of the signs, and it takes place at a wedding party in the least expected place you could possibly imagine the first of Jesus's miracles to be taking place. It's just, this could be any town, any community, any day of the week. It's an important day, but weddings happen all the time, and it's full of people, full of incident, full of detail, and I think this is partly what Tim was getting at. You can miss this. You can miss this. That guy didn't have to wake up on the train and look over and read the sign and say, no, hang on a sec, I need to go back and be reconciled with my family. In your story, we can miss the detail. We can miss the voice. We can miss him telling us so easily, it seems to me. And that's what I get from the wedding at Cana, is all the detail, all the buzz. And it's easy to miss the fact that, the wine's got better. And that needs to those details need to speak to us, don't they? I think that's all I wanted to say. But thank you, Patrick.
No, thank you. That's really good. Thank you. And the picture's beautiful. Thank you, Angus, for showing it to us.
Do that again.
Angus, you wanted to say something?
No, not at all. Except thank you.
Can we see
thank you from the bottom of our hearts. That was absolutely wonderful.
And
so thought-provoking. We shall think about that talk for a long time. This is Maura, who's joined me, and she held the picture up.
Well, I think it was the wrong picture.
Would you like to hold the picture up again?
It was the Last Supper, actually. I got.
Was it?
No, it isn't. It says the wedding feast.
That's it.
No, that's it. Yes.
That's it.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
That's
Yeah.
it. Yes.
No.
Anyway, no.
Anyway, we look forward to.
Thank you.
We shall think about that talk for a long time. Thank you. Thank you.
There's somebody on an iPhone who's wanting to speak, or you?
Someone lying down here?
Yeah. No.
No.
One reflection I had, Patrick, which I never thought about before, was how at the end of the Bible, we're invited to the wedding feast of the Lamb, and here
yes,
Jesus is being invited to the wedding feast himself, and there's that sort of contrast at the beginning. I don't know if there's any significance in that at all.
Well, I think there is. I think that's absolutely right. And it's interesting also to reflect on the fact, I know there's a lot of discussion amongst the scholars about who wrote the Apocalypse in, the book of Revelation. But generally, the church, certainly the Orthodox Church, has no doubt that that it was John, the theologian, as they call him. And if you ever go there, there's a monastery just below what's called the Cave of the Apocalypse, which is devoted to John the theologian. And of course, in the final chapters of the book of Revelation, you have the marriage feast of the Lamb. And so then the question is, you know, what came first? The writing of the book of Revelation, which possibly even came before this, that's say St. John's Gospel, in which case, you know, John would have had very much in his mind the whole idea of the consummation, and of course that's a kind of marriage word, isn't it? The consummation of all things being a wedding, you know, being the wedding between, you know, the Lamb and the people of God. It's picture language, of course, but it's saying an intimacy really between God and his church, you know, Christ and his church. And it wouldn't surprise me with John, with all his love of metaphor and everything, thinking that, you know, here is the first sign, which is at a wedding. Here is the last vision of what's going to happen at the end, which is a wedding. And in between, we have the story of the life of Jesus, and we have the narrative of the church. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot in that, Gerald. It's quite difficult to get your head around it all, I think, but worth reflecting on.
Thank you. Anybody want a last question?
Yeah, can I jump in on something?
Yeah.
I wonder what the servants were thinking when they poured the first wine out of the water jar.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely brilliant thought, actually, and one would absolutely, I know, one imagines they want to have a taste of it at some point, because they saw this extraordinary thing happen, and then they hear possibly from the master of the feast how good it is. But yeah, what an extraordinary thing to witness. And of course, one of a number of things like that. I mean, I suppose the same is going to be true of the feeding of the 5,000 in John chapter 6. You know, the apostles suddenly find, you know, the bread and going around 5,000 people. So there are these sort of stunning moments, really. And you're right to think, what would the servants have thought, and how did it affect them, you know, being part of this? And yeah, it's a great thought.
We've got Mark.
I was about to.
Kirkbride after Mark. Mark.
Yeah, I was about to comment on the servants, and because it's very interesting that you've got the conversation between Mary and Jesus and the bridegroom and the master of the feast. But the servants have a really important role, and you know, maybe there are times when we're asked to be like the servants for God, where we follow something simple that God asks us to do. We may not even know what a blessing that might be to others, but it's really interesting to reflect on the role of the servants in this narrative.
I think that's such a good point, and you know, it brings to mind a story from the Old Testament, which is of the healing of a man called Naaman. I don't know if you remember him, who had leprosy. And the way he discovered about his cure, that he could be cured, you know, by the prophet Elijah, was through the servant girl who worked for him. And she looked at him and said, look, you know, you're a leper, but I do know someone who could help you. And she is the key link in the chain. And I think that's just wonderful. I think it's part of the providence of God. And I think, you know, nothing is so small that it doesn't matter. You know, and I think what you say is so true, Mark.
And Jane Kirkbride, who...
Yes. First of all, thank you, Patrick. But just a few thoughts that occurred to me about Mary. I felt that she, well, two things. One is that Jesus, in a way, could appear to be a bit dismissive. You know, what's it to do with me that the wine's run out?
I know.
But she knew about him.
Yes.
We know from the Magnificat, she knew the significance of the child she had, and you're reminded of her faith. But she just says to the servants, "Do whatever he tells us." She didn't turn around and say to Jesus, "Well, surely you can help these people." She just told the servants, "Do whatever he says," and that reminds us of some of the miracles where I think someone touched Jesus's cloak and he said, "Your faith has made you whole," because that same sort of faith and trust. So that was just a comment. But could I ask a question? Excuse me. In the first line of the first verse, it said on the third day.
Oh yes, yeah.
And that's the very familiar phrase because we hear it in the creed, on the third day he rose again. Is there any significance in that?
Well, that's a really good point, Jane. I think I have looked at it, and the scholars kind of say we don't really know why it was the third day, and again the question is this something to do with John, and using a play on words, because we all know the third day was the day of resurrection. Is it at the beginning of the gospel him indicating in a rather clever way that the new life has started? With the ministry of Jesus beginning, or is it something more, prosaic, that was 3 days after something else which we don't know about? And I suppose, as so often with John, it's a combination, possibly the two. That's to say, it's a, it's probably a profound point about, a new beginning is being made. It's the third day in that sense. Yeah. But also it may be something quite prosaic. It's 3 days after something else had happened, but we don't know what what it was.
Yeah. Thank you.
I don't know.
Time,
Angus.
Yes.
Could I just add one little thing to my previous rather not very useful comment? It seems to me that what Patrick has helped us to understand is that through this story, through this extraordinary happening at the wedding, we can find grace and truth and Jesus in all the very, very ordinary things of life. No matter what we're doing or where we are, this grace and truth is there amongst us all the time. And I've personally find it sometimes quite difficult to feel that in whatever we're doing in life. But here is an extraordinary event which shows us that Jesus is actually with us, no matter how ordinary we may be, our lives may be for a time being, or what we're doing, he is there with us. And I feel that that's a very important, for me, part of listening to what Patrick has had to say about this, and I'm grateful for that. Thank you.
That's a great thought, Angus. Thank you.
I think we are we're coming up towards the hour now, so I think we probably will stop there. But same place, same time next week. Do join us again, and just a huge thank you, Patrick.
No, pleasure, a real pleasure to see everybody, and look forward to seeing you again.
And I don't know whether you'd like to just close us with a prayer.
Indeed, I would. Thank you. So let's pray. Lord Jesus Christ, we thank you for this first sign that you did in Cana of Galilee, which in one sense is so familiar, and yet in another way has so many levels to it. And we pray that you'd help us to know your grace, that we may receive grace upon grace in our lives, although we may not deserve it at all. And pray that we would know that grace, that undeserved love, that help, that strength in our own lives, and that we would learn to listen and to do whatever you tell us in our lives, that there may be wonderful things, exceptional wine being produced as a result. So we thank you for this great story, for John's Gospel, and pray you continue to speak to us in the meantime before we meet again. We ask your blessing upon us and all those whom we love. In Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Patrick. And a reminder that the questions that you're suggesting will be up on the Veda Pusi website, as will a recording of this talk, so you can listen to it again. And see you all next week. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, Gerald.
Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick and Gerald.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Amazing.
Gerald. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brilliant. What a great idea. Oh.